The title of our conversation today is Writing the Big Impossible Thing. And I think I can't imagine something bigger than a mother, right? Or more impossible than approaching something like that. And in both cases, and just to explain a little bit, this is, Natasha has written not only in her memoir, but in her poetry about the loss way too early of her mother. And Luis's last novel it's fiction, but it's very much based on your mother and her experiences in the Red Cross and a lot of trauma. And I think you're processing your own grief about her as well. How do you approach something that big? And by big, I mean your first conception of the world is largely made of this person, right? How do you step back far enough from that force in your life to be able to write about it with words, rather than just have a feeling about it?
You go first.
Me? Oh, my mother was such a remarkable person. She wasn't just a Red Cross person. She was a World War II Red Cross woman. If you don't know the book, they were called donut dollies. Yeah. And they drove a 2.5-ton truck with a kitchen in the back, along with Patton. They landed on Omaha Beach, and they drove across France, liberated Paris. The first vehicle to enter Paris in the liberation was a donut truck. Yeah.
And she was there at the liberation. It wasn't Auschwitz. It was
Buchenwald.
It was Buchenwald, right?
And she was in the siege of Bastogne. And then she was nearly killed. Horrible injuries. So everything in the novel is actually the physical things and places where she was. And I didn't know how to write it. I didn't know how to tell her story. I backed toward it in a lot of poetry, interestingly, and in some nonfiction things. And I think my wife Cindy, she's a journalist, and at night we have a little 2-person workshop very often where we're discussing things. And she had said to me years ago, "Tell me again what your mother did." And I said, "Oh, it's a donut dolly." And she said, "What's a donut dolly?" And I said, "Well, it's the women who went to war and made coffee and donuts in combat." And she said, "What?"
Donuts in combat is kind of a funny sentence.
I know, it is. It's absurd. The whole thing's absurd.
Yeah.
And it just all of a sudden opened this hatch. I thought, if Cindy doesn't know, nobody knows. And then these memories of my mom started flooding back to me. And, just little things, constant little things that get richer and richer as you get older and get some knowledge. Yeah. I did this a lot in book tour, but I probably didn't see any of you on book tour. But she got me out of bed one morning, and she's called me dear boy, Lucci, dear boy. I say, "What?" She said, "We're going to the movies." I said, "Oh, what are we going to see?" "We're going to see Patton." And I thought, "Oh, great." And we went down there and we watched it, and she was transfixed. And then got ready to leave, and she said, "Oh, no, we're going to watch it again." 3 hours. So we watched it again, and then watched it a third time, and I was just about to kill myself, And we got on the bus to go home, and honestly, in some ways, the book comes from this moment. She looks at me and she says, "Georgie Patton was a very naughty boy." And I thought, wait, there's somebody in my mom that I do not know. And she had horrible PTSD, I know now, dreams, screaming terror. So that was all astonishing. And the last part of it, and this is where the nonfiction work is also, because it was largely a work of reportage, fictionalized in ways, but we realized that her driver, who we thought had died, was not only alive, but living in Champaign we're in Naperville, not too far. I thought my whole life this woman had been dead. And she took us in, and we were with her close friends, and she was a source for us till she died at 102.
Yeah.
You know, I think for me, figuring out how to write about my mother was to make use of a couple of abiding metaphors for me that have everything to say about my relationship to her. You know, it's a way of trying to make visible the imprint she left on me. Yeah. So, you know, for example, in the very beginning of Memorial Drive, I tell a story about my mother being pregnant and back home in Mississippi waiting for me to arrive. And, you know, the kind of folk logic that people use to tell her things to do while she was waiting so that she wouldn't, you know, worry hair or do too many things. And one of them was to sit on your hands, you know, so that she wouldn't, because if you twist your hair, you know, you're going to gray a lock of the child's hair. All these kind of things that you can do if you don't find a way to not do it. But by sitting on her hands, I think one of the things that she did was, or at least the metaphor for me is that she imprinted this birthmark on the back of my thigh that is large and like the shape of a country that I think of my mother imagining going to, but having never been in, because she's bringing a mixed-race black child into America in 1966. So what other place, what other geography would she imprint? The other that's similar to that is one of those photographs I've written about many times. I think I'm only 3 years old, and a photographer has come to the house to make a family portrait of me and my mother and father. And I must be squiggly or doing something like that. And there's a moment that you see this in the photograph. She's standing sort of behind me, and she's touching me like this, as if to sort of get me to stop moving around. But as many times as I've looked at that photograph, one of the times I thought, well, that's the imprint. She's leaving it. It's sort of like that metaphor that my former colleague Carol Anderson used in her book White Rage, that to see that invisible thumbprint, you have to throw that black dust on it, and then you see it. And so that was that imprint of my mother's mano prieta, that lovely dark hand of hers. And finally, the other abiding metaphor, you know, took me a long time to kind of piece together, but I think in 2013, I went to Seoul, to South Korea, and I met with some artists and poets and scholars there. And they had read Native Guard, which is, you know, the whole first section is elegies to my mother. And at the end of the night, one of the scholars said to me, you know, we have a saying here in South Korea that one doesn't bury the mother's body in the ground, but in the chest. Or like you carry her corpse on your back. And it was stunning to hear that these people who had just met me could see the way that I carried my mother's corpse on my back. And I sort of struggled with that for a long time because it's not, you know, the greatest image in the world. And so then one year, my friend Deborah Paredes invited me to come give a reading at Cantamundo. And I went. And during the circle at Cantamundo, she asked the group of us, what is one thing you want to bury? And what is one thing you want to plant? And I listened as people went around, and I was thinking, and then it occurred to me that, like that wonderful poem of Machiko Dead, whose poem is that? Jack Gilbert, right. That poem that I talk about, I love it so much because he's describing what this grief feels like, and he likens it to a man carrying a box. And how, you know, at first, you know, you can carry it like this, but then it gets heavy and you put it on one shoulder, and it gets too heavy, and then you put it on the other shoulder. And when it gets too heavy for that shoulder, you can finally carry it out in front of you again without ever having to put it down. And that's what that grief, that corpse feels like. It's not a thing that I want to put down. I want to carry that corpse. So I thought about, what do I want to bury? What do I want to plant? And that's when I realized that I sort of had two mothers. I have that corpse that I carry on my back that I never want to put down. But I also have the living mother that I have planted in my chest. And that memory of her, that living memory, grows and grows. So I'm not burying, I am planting and carrying that grief. What I realized, and this is the last piece of this, I used an epigraph from Shakespeare's Sonnet Number 3. These lines, "Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime." It is the way that, indeed, I am the invisible made visible. So to write about my mother, I had to realize I was really writing about myself. Because people would always say, well, what's your mother like? And I'd say, if you want to know what she's like, look at the woman she made.
Mm-hmm. We are the archives.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether, you know, it's, do you find the papers, do you not find the papers, do you talk to the person, do you not talk to the person, but the archive is walking around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that other archive you asked me about, I was walking in town in Decatur, Georgia, 20 years after my mother's death. And my husband and I went and sat at the bar at this restaurant we like to go to. And at some point, this man came over and he said to me, did I just see you two walking from the hotel? And I said no, because we were walking from home. It didn't occur to me that maybe he meant by the hotel. And so he said, oh, I'm sorry to bother you. And he went and sat down. And then a few minutes later, the bartender came over and said, the guy over there wanted to just send you guys a round of drinks and to say that he was sorry. And I thought, well, that's really odd. And so I got up to go over and thank him for the drinks. He was sitting there with his wife. And I just sort of was, making small talk with him. And, out the window where they were sitting, I could see the courthouse where, the sentencing of my mother's killer had happened. And I asked him what he did, and he said, oh, I'm assistant district attorney. And I said, oh, I used to know the district attorney here. And he said, oh, well, how do you know, J. Tom? And I looked out toward the courthouse and I said, oh, there was this case years ago. And then he looked at me and he said, was your mother Gwen and your brother Joey? And I said, yes. And I looked at his wife because I thought that was strange. And I looked back at him and he was weeping. And she said, there's not a moment that goes each day that goes by that he doesn't think about your mother. And it turns out he was the first police officer on the scene, and he recognized me from that day. Later, when I was brought to the police station in shock, he recognized in the 40-year-old woman, the 19-year-old girl that I had been. And he told me that they purge all the files after 20 years. And so they were just about to purge all the records of, and so he offered to get them and to give them to me. And that's how I had that entire police file, including the 12, 13-page document she was writing on yellow legal paper that seemed like a speech that she might have given to a domestic violence shelter about her own journey to the shelter. It was in her briefcase that morning.
I think it's amazing, and I know so many writers, and I've had this happen to me too, sometimes in just charming ways, sometimes in very profound ways, that the thing you're writing about finds you in the world. You become sort of a magnet in a very inexplicable on the logical level kind of way. You find the person you were looking for, the person finds you. You find the picture, someone mentions the thing in conversation, someone introduces you to the person, and I have no idea what that is about, but it's an amazing thing about being an artist. You kind of maybe open yourself up to some other level of receiving things. It sounds very woo-woo, but
It does, but it seems so true.
Yeah,
it is true, I think.
So I want to ask you, in writing big, scary things, these things or other things, because we've all written many big, scary things, right? And we'll continue to. I think there's this fascinating balance between getting close enough to the material and porous enough to be able to draft this thing, and then getting enough distance from it and being kind of hard-hearted and critical enough to revise the thing. And then being brave enough to put the thing into the world, right? And you somehow have to be all three of those people, not always at the same time, which is probably how we can do it. But I know we have writers here in the audience, people, maybe working on their first thing, their 15th thing. And I wonder what you might be able, each of you, to give them in terms of that advice of approaching the terrifying thing, the place you have to put yourself in to be able to write it, but then the place you can recede to or have to recede to still hold it. And I still remember, when we were talking about your memoir way back, we're talking about the parts that were maybe the hardest for you to look at, and you said to me, I bet there are typos in them, because I couldn't bring myself to really proofread. And I said, no, there aren't, I promise. And I think about that I wrote it and I can't look at it. I'm sure, you look at it, certainly your editor looks at it, but to the extent that you might pour over something that wasn't as personal. So I don't know if you guys can think about and talk about that kind of that closeness and that distance that are both so necessary.
Is it my turn to go first?
I don't know.
You can.
I think that one of my obsessions that I've never named really, but I know it's true, is to bear witness.
Yeah.
And I think it was partially because of the translating life as a little boy. And so a lot of times I think the unbearable stuff is the stuff I need to bear witness to.
Right.
I think none of us have a dearth of awful things in the archive.
Not running out soon.
No, the life's so much better now.
Yeah.
But there are. I'm pretty ferocious about a project when I start it, and I can't not do it, though I find ways. I get up in the morning and think, well, let's see what's on TV. One more cup of coffee, and Cindy will often urge me to go to work because I don't want to face it. I don't want to, it starts getting really painful. And so many of the projects I've done have been deeply painful, but I think for me, when I was a little kid, I wanted to be a monk, a priest. I went to Catholic school. The nuns pretty much did the nun, square dance with me, holding one arm and whipping me with a yardstick. But in spite of that, I still wanted to do that. And I think that's part of it. I think I feel a responsibility to the spirits, both holy and unholy. And also I think because so much of my work is honestly not, it sounds pretentious, but it has ended up being this witness.
Yeah.
There's so much I need to witness. We all do. And, you know, having come from the Tijuana border of all places, and my entire life, because I'm a white boy, hearing people talking smack about stinking Mexicans until I say, you know, I'm Mexican. But that really, you know, it's a really interesting thing. And sometimes, the book before this, it's called The House of Broken Angels, and it was inspired by my brother's death. My big brother, the one who would do the dictionary test with my dad. And it was the weirdest thing because it was an event of high hilarity and horrible tragedy all together. And if that's not catnip for an author to try to do that. My brother was dying, and it was such a Mexican death. He was dying of cancer. They all knew he was going to die, and all the cholos and offspring and gangbangers in the family got together and said, hey, let's give Pops a wake while he's still alive. And they're like, whoa, it's a good idea, man, so he can party, right? And they made the wake for him. And, you know, we were like, we got to go to this. This is too much. And his mom, not my mom, but his mom died the week before his wake. And he was so pissed. He was like, Mom. So on Saturday, we had her funeral. And on Sunday, we had my brother's dying wake. And it was just insane. But I did not know it was a story. It was, you know, it's the stuff we've all lived with. So I was like, oh, another crazy Mexican scene. And Cindy kept saying, you got to write this. I said, what am I going to write? Amazements galore. You know, not the least, just to show you how stupid things are, tragic and funny at once. We're at the grandma's funeral. My half-brother, also named Luis, but my dad had forgotten he'd used that name and named me Luis. So he had grown up on his middle name, right? And he's, oh, carnal, you know, the organ's playing and everybody's all sad. The old woman has died. And my brother says, oh, my son's here. You know, he's a musician. And I said, oh, where is he? He said, come, mijo, come here. And this big lunk comes over. Hi, Tio. I said, hey, how you doing, man? Oh, I'm good, Tio. His father says, tell him what you do, mijo. He says, well, I play Norwegian death metal. Right? And I'm not going to burst out laughing in the funeral, but I said, wait, you're a Mexican Norwegian death metal band? Yeah, Tio. And I said, what do you play? And he said, well, I'm the singer. And I said, do you do the Cookie Monster voice, dude? And he, in the middle of the funeral, goes, extreme, like this. And his father's like, no, mijo. And I can't believe I didn't realize that would be a great scene in a story. And the next day was much more tragic. So, you know, it was so hard for me to write. There were scenes that I could only speak because I couldn't see because I was crying so hard. And I asked Cindy to type, and I just walked back and forth frantically. Because I think there's a moment that you have to honor. It may be the only memorial to those people. And, you know, I'm so aware of so many of the people in my life that will never be remembered, never get a record, certainly weren't able to tell their story. But I was placed there to see it, you know?
I think one of the most important things there is that we should all be married to Cindy.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. I got there first.
Natasha, how about you? Do you find that like that distance in any way, or is it?
Yeah, you know, the first chapter that I wrote for Memorial Drive is a chapter called 1985. And it appears later, you know, toward the end of the book. But 1985, it is a chapter about getting the knock on the door, the police being there, telling me that I need to call this number, This is when I learned, that my mother has been killed. You might think that was the most difficult chapter to write, but it isn't, because, immediately after a trauma like that, there's a way that you tell the story to people, and that kind of trauma imprints in this perfectly sort of crystallized or in amber kind of way. And you almost tell the story exactly the same every time.
Yes.
So when I wrote that chapter, I was just telling this story that I had so much distance from, that was already just in amber or whatever, The hardest chapter to write is a chapter in the first section called You Know, and it is in the second person. It's the only chapter in the book that is in the second person, and it begins, you remember even though you don't want to. And I didn't want to. It was the last thing I wanted to do. And that is the chapter when I'm in the 5th grade and I hear for the first time my mother being beaten. And I hear her voice. That was the hardest one to write. And it's the one, and I end it, by saying something like, look at you. Even now you think you can distance yourself right in the second person, as if you weren't the one to whom any of this happened. That was a created distance with that second person. And the third way that I think I try to write the hard thing, the moment of witnessing something also, is actually to try to go into an experience in the moment so that what I'm at least feeling and capturing is new. So, for example, even though I had that archive for, I got it in 2005 and over 10 years before I actually looked at it, because I knew that when I looked at it, I wanted to be ready to feel it and to even be able to sort of record what I felt. One of the things was to go to the Georgia Department of Corrections. Because, if you go to look for an inmate, there, you have to click, if you know the inmate number, you have to click through many screens. And each time you get to a different screen that says, are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to see this person? And you get to the last screen and it says, are you really sure you want to do this? Because the image is going to come up really fast.
Oh.
And the moment I hit that button, I saw it rose from the bottom up. The screen sort of populated from the bottom up, and I looked at the face of this man that I hadn't seen, for 30 years or so. But that experience it's a new one. It was a new one, and it was a new way to enter into not only that moment, but to enter into some past that I had created distance from, but I knew I needed to collapse the distance between that past with that present experience.
There's also then that question, and this is maybe, I think in terms of time, kind of the last thing I'll ask you, and then we'll get some questions from the audience. But we all think, at some point about, okay, I'm going to put this into the world. It's going to be received in whatever way. And the more personal that is, the more fraught that becomes. But then there's this other layer that we're kind of talking about tonight, since we're sponsored here by the Pulitzers, which is fortunately kind of all good, right? Like, this isn't anyone giving something a bad review. It's not the nasty person on Goodreads or the weird person that they're reading, right? But kind of taking the books that are, that are great and then elevating from even those this small group of ones that people really believe in, and then elevating out of those one that they really want to show the world. And we've all three been in positions, certainly of being judged by that kind of panel, but also of doing that kind of judging, which sounds like not the right word to use, but that kind of selection, let's say. I wonder, there's like 17 questions I could ask you about this, but I think that one thing that being a judge for prizes like that really did for me was it made me think a lot about not just what is good and not just even what is great, but what is lasting, what is, what speaks kind of beyond moment and genre and even individual story. You know, you're presented with 5 or whatever equally beautiful, completely different books, and then you're asked which one. I wonder if you can talk at all about how maybe the process of being in that position might filter into your own writing at all, or is it something you put completely out of your head when you write? Or anything you've learned from doing that? Or just anything else, maybe anything else that you want to say about kind of that dual position a lot of us find ourselves in, of being the person putting the work out and kind of hoping it speaks to people, and also being one of the people picking out of this beautiful group the thing that we think is the one.
I remember thinking in one of those situations, when I was looking at these very wonderful books, but still needing to say which one.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking about one of them. I love this book so much. This is a book that I feel like I could have written. But the other book was the book I wish I could write.
Ooh.
That was the one.
Yeah. You know, one of the challenges for me as a judge is to try with whatever committee I'm in, whatever panel I'm on, to just suggest that whiz-bang astonishments are great, but if you get an absolutely brilliant, quiet book, to give that book the same heft.
Yeah.
And I always fight for those books as hard as I can, because there have been some books that, after I don't even remember who won those years, those books are on my shelf and I revere them, because something happens in, you know, and I know it's personal, you know, it's a question of taste. That's why we have a committee, so we can argue these things out. But you know, that's one thing. And the other thing about on the personal side of all this, I think the trajectory of your attention changes. And so when I was a callow youth, I was writing to blow myself away, and you know, whatever pals I had, or my girlfriend, or whatever, you know, it was always like, it was performative. And then when something so cataclysmic happened, you know, my father's death, and I had to buy his corpse from the Mexican cops. Yeah. He died bringing me college graduation money, and they didn't find it, and somebody gave me the money, and I had to use the money to buy his corpse.
Wow.
That's a conundrum.
That's fucked up.
It was fucked up.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, I had a story that was so important, I didn't even know how to do it. It was the first time, you know, when you get that thing that you don't know how to write. And so I wrote it, and it was the worst horror of my life writing that. But, you know, it got in the hands of somebody who was here. And she published it, and everything changed. So I think that horrible time really imprinted in me the need to bear witness.
Yeah.
And so I think that what you're asking, that has a lot to do with how I approach projects, I think.
Yeah.
The witness that's needed, and the story that shouldn't remain in the shadows if you can help it.
Yeah. I think it invites you to take yourself and your work more seriously, if anything, right? To be in these conversations, to be part of these conversations about what is a great book. You start to feel like, well, I'm someone who maybe has some small say in that. I'm someone who is part of that conversation.
Yeah.
And you just, feel, I don't know, maybe slightly more up to the task of the big terrifying book, the big terrifying subject.
Yeah. And, chairing committees, which we all do now, I've learned to just ease my own pain because they're books that you just love.
Oh, yeah.
And the rest of the committee's
else
like,
gets
what are
it."
you kidding? So when I realized that to be, to be nominated for the award, that at least will go in a sticker on a book cover, and that'll help. Then to be a finalist, that's another level, and then to be the winner. So that's one of the ways, because I to borrow a recovery term from my friends, I'm very codependent to the writers. And that's how I ease my own suffering in a book that I think should win. And I've had to fight for them just to get it to, be nominated.
Yeah. Well, the last thing maybe I'll say, and then we'll see the questions, just into questions, something I want to say is that I think one thing that I've learned to really pay attention to as I select books for that kind of thing is what is going to stay with me. It's hard to know because you don't have a year to judge the prize, so you have to start to know yourself what's going to stay with me. And both of you write books that have deeply stayed with me. Books that I can look at that cover and recall what it's about, that an individual poem or a scene. And that's something that, there are books that I've loved that haven't stayed with me, and there are books that I don't like that have stayed with me.
Oh yeah, damn them.
Right? But the best thing of all is when you love a book and it stays with you, and you feel like just the thought of that book brings it back. So it's something that you've both given me, and I really appreciate that. And I think we have a microphone over here.
Thanks for an amazing evening, really moving. I wondered what you think your parents would think about the writers you've become.
My father got to witness. My father was also a poet, and he was with me when I gave my closing lecture at the Library of Congress in 2014. And then he died not long after that. My mother, there's a moment in Memorial Drive when I have come home from school. I'm probably about 14. I'm really excited. I've joined the newspaper staff. I'm writing for Quill and Scroll, which is the school literary journal. And I'm just so thrilled about it. And the four of us are sitting down to dinner, my stepfather, my mother, my brother, and I. And I'm telling about all of this and how I'm going to write this other story. And my stepfather says, "You're not going to do any of that." And I see my mother's hand tense around the utensil she's holding. And she says, "She will do whatever she wants." And I knew in that moment that that resistance to him was going to get her beaten for it. But the one thing that she would not do was allow him to squash any of my dreams. I am exactly what she was making, what she was setting into motion. I think she would think that.
My parents never saw anything I published. I mean, the first thing I published was about my father's death, so he didn't see that. And my mother couldn't read it. She wouldn't touch it. But, you know, her great hope was amazing. And crazy things happen to all of us, good things. So I got hired, believe it or not, to teach writing at Harvard.
Never heard of it.
Yeah, it's a freaking junior college. I didn't know what I was getting into. And we were in really terrible straits. And my mother, I've never forgotten this, the last Christmas before I left San Diego to go to Boston and Cambridge, she didn't have anything. So she gave me a little strip of wrapping paper. She said, "Here, dear boy." She's coming. I told you, dear boy. And I opened it, and it was stamps. And she said, "This is so you'll submit one more story to one more magazine."
Oh, that's great.
I know. But she never saw the outcome.
To lighten the mood slightly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My father was also a poet, and he had just very rarely said anything nice to anyone. But when I was a Pulitzer finalist, it was in the last month of his life, and I called him, and he was in Budapest. He'd moved back to Hungary. And I told him, and the entirety of his response was, "Oh, you know, George Pulitzer was Hungarian." I'll take it.
Thank you.
It was as close to approval as we're going to get.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank you all for your conversation tonight. As a writer crossing genre for the first time, I needed to hear everything. My question is, as writers and as judges, how do you think the Pulitzer Prizes is shaping the conversation that's happening in the country right now, but also for the last few decades, and what it might do going forward?
Great question. Wow. It's changed. It's really changed.
Yeah.
I mean, you look back, I know I'm not insulting any Pulitzer administrators here. They weren't involved in the prize like 30 years ago. But let's just, you look back, and it was sure a bunch of straight white dudes winning that prize. Part of what's changed, I think what's changed that texture is prioritizing judging panels and a Pulitzer Board that have much more texture and diversity. And
You can't say that word.
Oh, right.
Oh, yeah, no. Uh-oh. They're listening, you know.
I know they are. But you actually, you have these incredible, and every judging panel, I've not judged the Pulitzer yet, I've judged a lot of other prizes. Every judging panel I've been part of has been this wonderful mix of background experience. And that helps so much in terms of elevating the voices that were not the same voice. So that's part of it. What else?
Yeah, I agree that the makeup of the juries can change so much. I'm thinking about. This is one of the ways that I think about, like, if you look at the books that have won the Pulitzer Prize in poetry in the last 2.5 decades. Yeah. It is remarkable. And I want to just give a shout out to organizations like Cave Canem, Cantamundo, Kundiman, because Toy and Cornelius starting Cave Canem, and my book won the first Cave Canem Prize 25 years ago.
The first one.
2000, and I got to judge Cave Canem this year. So 25 years later, Rita Dove judged it that first year, and I judged it this 25 years later. But before 2007, when I won, you could count on one hand the African-American poets who had won, Gwendolyn Brooks, Rita Dove, Yusuf Komunyakaa, and then me. But since then, I mean, how many? Tracy, Tayimba, Jericho, Greg, Carl. I mean, I'm missing some. There's just so many. But it was just this moment where all of a sudden, Cave Canem is making sure that these books that might have been marginalized otherwise are on mainstream presses. They were just answering a need. What people, I know I've forgotten so many people who've won a Pulitzer, so I know this is being recorded. I didn't mean to forget you because you were there. But when it answers, and I think that these books that win answer what the public has been wanting to read. That's why they're there. And these juries that see that have helped to shape what we read now. A renaissance in poetry, I would say definitely, and perhaps in other genres as well.
And sometimes it elevates the book, especially for fiction. Maybe it was already the book that kind of everyone was reading, but still, you see that book shoot onto the bestseller list and stay there. And sometimes it is the book it is that dark horse, and you go, who, what? But it was just that book that wasn't getting that spotlight, and suddenly, not only that book, but that author's career, that the institution where they teach their students, those little lines just going out everywhere. That was effective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and our culture evolves and readers evolve, and I think it's fantastic. And we talked about this I think earlier, but I volunteer to judge a lot, and I feel like I can't take time off from that because I want to keep making sure everything's okay in the.
Yeah.
But the Pulitzers is an astonishing thing. And the year I was a finalist, they called me to tell me you're a finalist, and don't worry, it's going to change your career anyway. And I was like, it is? And it did. So it's a beautiful thing.
They called you. They didn't call me. I found out on Twitter.
No. That was before. I'm old, man. But it was a wonderful thing. It was just it was a really a generous gesture from somebody who didn't have to make it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Those things, it's important. There's a lot of great movement happening, and there's so many great awards out there now. That it gives me a lot of hope. Yeah.
Hello. If you could think back to the first book that you were writing and the fear that comes with putting your work out there and dealing with criticism, any advice for how you kind of overcome that fear or how you manage it?
Well, it depends if by putting out you mean publishing or like sending out, to like...
Even just sending it out.
Yeah. You know what? I'll start. I can start.
Yeah.
Please.
I'll solve the time. What I'm always telling my students or friends who are putting things out there for the first time is to gamify it seriously. Like this is about that getting distance. Like make a rejection thermometer, and when you get 10 rejections, you get to go get sushi. And when you get 10 rejections,
I wish I'd known that.
Yeah.
Oh.
And then you're like, you get the rejection. You're like, oh, that sucks. I'm at 19 now. Kind of, you have to have a sense of humor about it. And I think what's so much easier to see on the other side of things is how arbitrary these things can be, how much everyone receiving your work is just a human who might be having a bad day, or a journal where they go, we already have too many first-person stories, we can't take it.
Yeah.
Yes.
You don't know that that's why they said no. These little things, right?
We have
That's
no
right.
way of knowing. I always tell my students that you don't know if they have indigestion.
Yeah.
They're having a terrible divorce. They had some really bad Coke last night. You don't know what is happening.
You have the same last name as someone they hate.
Oh!
You know? Like,
Yeah,
yeah, you know?
yeah.
Like, I'm like their cousin, I can't take them. You don't know. Yeah, but I mean, that's, yeah. I mean, I also think it helps a lot to be working on the next thing. If that thing is done,
Yep.
then the thing you're putting out there, you know, anyone can say anything about it, and at least on some level you can say, well, yeah, but that was my last thing, my next thing.
Yeah, just wait.
Helps.
Hi. So I think one big question that often comes up, especially if a writer deals in like personal essay or memoir, is the question of, should I be telling this? Especially, yeah, right. Especially if it has to do with like a personal family thing or even with your friends. And I was wondering for you all, how you deal with that central tension of, should I be telling this, and how you balance that with what needs to be said in order for the story to be told.
When I was working on Beyond Katrina, which is very much about my brother's story in the midst of the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, I was very worried about telling something or presenting him in a way that would not be the way that he presented himself, that he has the right to project who he is on his own. And I was very careful to tell parts of the story that sort of, for the most part, we owned together and that we talked about together. And I didn't want to tell his story, and I left those things out. They always felt to me like his story to tell. And so in Memorial Drive, I was very focused on telling the story of my mother through the lens of Natasha Trethewey. This was my story. And so it would always annoy me when you'd see those comments, like, you look at them sometimes, like, well, I really wanted to know more about her brother. Like, what happened to the brother? Why didn't she tell this? Or like, where's this person? I'm like, that's not what the story's about. That is not the story. This is the story that you got, And there's a choice there. I understand that even for prurient interest, there may be a desire to know what happened. And like people sort of read sometimes memoir or nonfiction, like you just want to know the prurient details, like what happened, as opposed to paying attention to the story that's being told. Mm-hmm. Because the situation and all the stuff that happened is not necessarily the story that you're telling. That's a very different thing.
Bravo.